When you are working toward a particular goal, you're very likely to experience two different effects that I'm going to go over here in just a second. The first of them is called the Valley of Disappointment, and this is something that was coined by James Clear in the book Atomic Habits, which I'm sure you have read. But I believe that the concept kind of applies very generally in life. The idea is that when you start something, you have a specific idea of what your progress is going to look like, and you expect it to be linear. But in reality, instead of it being linear, it tends to look a little bit more exponential. And so in the beginning, you don't see much of an effect for a very long time. And compared to your expectation, imagine it like a line, you are very much so below that expectation line for most of the time. But only if you continue do you finally get to the point to where you might hit an inflection point where your reality actually surpasses your expectations. And the time before that is called the Valley of Disappointment. And so what's happening here is you're going to be extremely discouraged. You're going to feel like you're not making any progress. The gains that you're seeing are so small that it feels like it's not even there. And like I said, eventually you hit that inflection point, and not only do you start seeing very visible, clear results, but you will also start to have results that surpass your expectations, and you start to potentially get a little bit euphoric about where you've gone. And now the thing is that's interesting about this, that I'm not sure he really talks about it or not in the book, but in reality, this repeats itself. And so essentially you're going to go through that again and again and again, because you're always going to be trying new things and or trying to take things to the next level. And in that point, you're going to start imagining linear progress yet again. And eventually you will get to the point where you've trained your brain to focus on the inputs, right, rather than the outcomes. Because that ends up being the most important thing. Is the only way for you to get through that valley of disappointment, the easiest way for you to get through that valley of disappointment, is to focus particularly on the inputs. Focus on the process, because when you get the process down and you fall in love with and consistently just repeat your process, then eventually you will actually make it through that valley of disappointment and be able to move forward. And some of the ways to think about, I've talked about this on the other channel a little bit, to make sure that you get through that valley of disappointment, is to make sure that instead of trying to, once again, like achieve a particular outcome, instead focus on how can you do what you've done a 1% better, right? When you do things 1% better every day, you get to the point to where at the end of a year, I think it was something like what, 30, you've gotten 30 times further than you would have. But only if you do that every day. Every day, if you just get 1% better, that's it. That's all it takes. At the end of a year, you've multiplied your returns on your investment of your time and your effort into whatever it is that you've been doing. So that was number one, called the Valley of Disappointment. That difference between your expectations and your reality until you actually surpass that reality, because your results are actually going to be exponential and not linear. The second thing is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is a very similar concept, but it has more to do with your confidence about everything. And in reality, these two things are going to intersect. And so what happens is when you start a new task, you get extremely confident. You say, oh, wow, I understand this. This is going to be amazing. I'm going to take over the world, or whatever it is that you have going on in your head. And then very quickly, you start to realize that you're actually way less competent than you may have thought. You start to your beginner's luck runs out in whatever it is that you may be doing, or just your excitement wears away because you realize that what you're doing is much harder than it seems. That peak is the peak of enthusiasm, and then that big, huge drop off is called the Valley of Despair. And what ends up happening is you slowly start to regain your confidence. You realize how many things that you know that you didn't know, and now you get to the point to where you are at the slope of enlightenment, is it called. Slope of enlightenment. And then after that, you get to a plateau of sustainability, where now you're confidently competent in what it is, and potentially even unaware of how competent you actually are, because you might still realize that there's so many things that you don't know that you don't know. And at least as you know that, right, you're not going to be overly confident. And in reality, once again, Surprise, you're going to go through this process all over again as you start new things or as you try to level up in whatever it is that you're trying to do. So you have the valley of disappointment, which is more about how your expectations are typically unmet until you hit that inflection point and your reality actually outpaces your expectations. And then you have the Dunning-Kruger effect and that valley of despair, where you recognize after having gotten extremely confident about something that you actually know way less than you thought you did, and you slowly work your way back out of that. So as you're going through life, once again, the way to really avoid all of this having a huge impact on you is to just focus in on the input. Focus in on what is your process. Focus in on your habits, like James Clear says in that book. I'm going to leave a link in the description to that book just in case you haven't already read it or you don't have it. That will be an affiliate link. So if you buy it, it may support the channel. And other than that, I'll see you next time.